We're here to receive testimony on research, diagnosis, and treatment of post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury in the Department of Defense and Department of Veterans Affairs.
Reported research on canine-assisted therapy. And by tracking both...
Since 2001, about 5% of the over 2.7 million service members deployed in support of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were diagnosed with PTS. And from 2000 through September 2015, there are over 339,000 TBI cases diagnosed, with most of these being mild TBI diagnosed in garrison locations.
The relationship between traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress.
Do you feel you have adequate resources at the moment to do your job?
We'd always love to have more,
Right.
but I think that especially with a drawdown in commitments overseas, what we're finding is that the resources aren't necessarily needed for the active, returning off the battlefield service members, much as they were just 3 or 4 years ago. But I think it's more for the long-term commitment that we have to these service members, some of whom were injured years ago. Understanding that it's not you patch them up and send them back out to the real world. Some of these people suffer for years.
He's going to see a different patient population than I'll see. And the prevalence of sexual assault in women compared to men is probably about 5 to 1. And Dr. Street's data and Nate Galbraith's data at SAPRO and some of Ron Kessler's data from Harvard support that. One of the things that we struggle with is getting men into care. Men are less apt to engage in care for sexual assault.
So I think you talk about two things that are very closely related.
The science for PTSD is probably more developed than the science is for TBI. Science for TBI is really in a nascent stage, so PTSD is a little easier to discern. It's a little easier to discern from a child psychiatry standpoint with regard to developmental trauma, just because the prevalence of that is so high. These academia and the private sector and research. The centerpiece of our...
From a historical perspective, we really became aware of PTSD following the Vietnam War, and so we've had that span of history to really think about the disorder, the diagnosis, and the treatment of the disorder. TBI is something that we've become so much more aware of due to the recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan.
And this was particularly relevant for military sexual trauma survivors. They were often diagnosed with a personality disorder as part of their discharge after they'd suffered a sexual assault. And with that discharge, they weren't entitled to VA benefits. So it was a huge problem for them because they have trauma, they're a survivor, they need mental health care, and they don't even have access to the VA anymore.
PTSD or brain